Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this very important topic, respect in the workplace and sexual harassment. I'd like to welcome Kate, who is a high-risk workplace inspector with Safe Work New South Wales, and she has almost 20 years experience working in health and safety roles in Australia and overseas, predominantly within mining and construction. So I'll hand all over to yourself, Kate.
Thank you so much, and thank you to yourself, Simone and Chris, for inviting me to talk to all these lovely women today. If anyone's got any questions, please feel free to ask them either anonymously or however you feel comfortable. I'm more than okay with that. So as Simone mentioned, my name's Kate Grahalis Ochoa, which is a mouthful, I'm aware. I'm an inspector with Safe Work New South Wales. I am a member of the construction group, and I'm in the high-risk workplaces and stakeholder engagement team. So we focus predominantly on what we call recalcitrant or PCBUs or employers, and try and implement strategies to control risks in high-risk workplaces. So I've been asked to talk to you guys today about respect in the workplace and workplace sexual harassment, which is a very emerging topic, something that wasn't around 20 years ago when I took on my first apprenticeship, but something that is really, really important and, really can't stress that enough, the importance of this. So any questions at all, please let me know. So, click. I first want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all are today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in our webinar. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters of New South Wales. So just something to be aware of. Content warning. If you need to, please step away. Come back when you're ready. There's some options here for some support. Here it says your EAP, insert details if known. I actually don't know the details of any of your EAPs. So if your employer has an EAP, just be aware that those systems are completely confidential. And any information that is fed back to your employer about EAP participation has all identifying information removed, or should have all identifying information removed. So you should feel comfortable to use those kinds of services. So what is sexual harassment? So it's defined in the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 as any unwelcome sexual advance, unwelcome request for sexual favours, or any other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature which makes a person feel offended, humiliated and or intimidated, and where a reasonable person would anticipate that reaction in the circumstances. So this can bring about some confusion sometimes. So when we talk about what a reasonable person would expect, what's reasonable for me as a 39-year-old woman who's been working in male-dominated industry for too long, would be different to what reasonable would look like for, say, a 16-year-old first-year apprentice. So that's something to be very aware of. So my reaction to someone's behaviour will never mirror the person sitting next to me's reaction. It's a very, very subjective and individualized response. So be aware of that. Also be aware that sexual harassment, unlike psychosocial injury, where we talk about the behaviors being ongoing, sexual harassment can just happen once. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, then that's sexual harassment. If a reasonable person would anticipate that reaction under the circumstances, which is all the technical mumbo jumbo, but bottom line is it's something that can happen just one time. So some common forms of workplace sexual harassment are sexually suggestive comments or jokes, intrusive questions about a person's physical appearance or private life, inappropriate staring or leering that makes you feel, it says here, intimidated, but just yucky. Any unwelcome touching, such as hugging, really getting into your personal space, that's cornering, or kissing, and any inappropriate physical contact. So we talked about the subjective nature of this, and it is a very subjective workplace hazard. So again, how I respond isn't going to be how someone else would respond. So please be aware of that. So it's, if someone feels offended, humiliated, or intimidated, and we're a reasonable person would anticipate that response. So again, there's the forms. It's really important that we all understand the subjective nature of it. So just because someone says to you, oh, you should be offended by that, we're on a job site. People say things like that all the time. Just because, you know, John doesn't think you should be offended doesn't mean you aren't. So be aware of that. It's a subjective test. So why is it an issue? So in the last 12 months, and this, the source for this is written down here, so the 5th National Survey on Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. So in the last 12 months, about 1 in 5 people reported that they have felt sexually harassed in the workplace. In the last 5 years, 1 in 3 people have been sexually harassed at work. And it's important to remember that whilst 41% of them are women, which is the vast majority, 26% of them are reportedly men. So whilst it's been occurring in Australian workplaces for a long time, obviously more recently in light of things like the Me Too campaign, it's become a really emerging topic. So it's important to remember that behind all the stories that you see in the media, there's real people and real workplaces. So for every headline you read, there are many more stories that we don't tell. And the impacts of workplace sexual harassment can be profound and devastating. So sexual harassment can be between individuals who have a workplace relationship. It can be during work. It can be in connection with work. And it's important to remember it's against the law for an employer to sexually harass a worker or for a worker to sexually harass another worker. So it can be at work. It can be when you're working at home remotely. It can be outside of work premises when you're fulfilling the functions of your role. It can be at the work Christmas party. It can be your boss texting you at night inappropriate things. So if it's in connection to work and in connection with your position of employment, then it would be considered workplace sexual harassment. So when we talk about the types of workers that are impacted, we've already said 41% were women and 26% were men. But look at this, almost 50% of those people were aged between 18 and 29. So 18 to 25, we would consider young workers. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more or are sexually harassed in the workplace more than others. 46% of those people identify as LGBTQIA+. 48% of those people have a disability or people who are insecurely employed. Underreporting of sexual harassment is a really big issue. And there's a big intersectionality between the groups. So I guess the point of this is it can be anyone. So just because, what am I trying to say here? Just because you think, oh, that shouldn't happen to me, doesn't mean it won't. This can happen to literally anyone. So who's harassing who? So that same national survey showed us that most incidents of sexual harassment, 77%, the harasser was male. And that's true for both the men harassed and the women harassed. So beyond being male, it's pretty difficult to identify any other typical characteristics of a harasser. You can't just look at someone and go, oh, they look like a harasser. So there's diverse behaviours and motivations that exist across those work groups. So it's also much more common in certain industries than others. So settings where there's a higher risk of experiencing sexual harassment are those that are male dominated, those that involve third parties, and those that are hierarchical in structure, or people who work isolated and remotely. So a male dominated industry would be one where the gender ratio is significantly more male to female. And then this bottom statement, I think, is really important. So it's not to say that most men are harassers, only that most harassers are male. So that's really important to remember. So not all men are harassers. That's not what we're saying here. We're just saying that most harassers are male. So what impacts can this have on workers? So we can feel isolated. You can have physical injuries if you're assaulted. You can experience psychological injury like stress, depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal thoughts. You can lose your confidence. It can have negative impacts on a person's career and job. And you can have illness as a result of stress, like cardiovascular disease, immune disorders. And 2/3 of people who are sexually harassed in the workplace have experienced negative impacts on their mental health. Something I want to touch on here that's really important is if you believe or if you have suffered sexual harassment in the workplace and it is negatively impacting your mental health, please, 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 please go and see your physician and seek some support. So a psychological injury as the result of workplace sexual harassment is a compensable injury. So you are covered by workers' compensation insurance for that. Obviously, there's criteria that need to be met and you need to get a certificate of capacity and all of those things. But if you have a diagnosable psychological injury as the result of sexual harassment, you need to seek mental health support and see your physician so that you can get the support and help that you need. So what can we do to prevent it? So we identify how, where, and when it might happen. We assess the likelihood that a worker may experience sexual harassment and how it might affect them by implementing the most effective control measures to prevent it, by working out how we will address it, and by checking our control measures are effective. So our expectations that we place on what we call PCBUs, persons conducting a business or undertaking, which is what the law references, which is essentially our employers, is we want them to identify any risk factor that can contribute to psychological injury, assess those risks, and then put in place steps to control those risks and review those control measures. So it's not good enough for someone to just say, that's just John. John likes to wolf whistle at the girls. That's not appropriate. If we know that, John or Joe or whoever might be someone who is one of these harassers, then it's up to the employer to put in place steps to control those risks. But the important part of that is whilst the onus is on the PCBU to identify any risk factors associated with sexual harassment, because this is so new and it's such an emerging topic, we need to remember that this could be a very new process for them and they don't know what they don't know. So if we don't tell our employer that this is what we're experiencing, or we don't share it with VERTO or with our apprenticeship provider or with Safe Work or with the union, then ultimately it's us who suffer and in silence, because there's no one there to provide that support to us. So why is it a workplace health and safety risk? So we talked about how our employers have the responsibilities. So they have this, what we call a primary duty of care to ensure the health and safety of all workers and other persons. So that includes health and safety and that's extended to include psychological injury. So to effectively control risks, the underlying causes must be addressed, which can include gender inequality, uneven power dynamics, incivility, harmful behaviors, irresponsible alcohol consumption. Something to think about. If someone's pressuring you at a work function to drink alcohol, go on, drink with us, have some more, have some more, have some more. Oh, you won't remember, not a big deal. It is a big deal. If you're put in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, you shouldn't be. You should never be put in a situation where you feel uncomfortable. So that's something to consider as well. Lack of consequences for the harassers or poor organizational justice, negative relationships, rigid gender roles, norms, practices, and structures that reinforce aggressive forms of masculinity. That's a sentence. So that's quite a large sentence. And what we mean by that is things like, John will do that because John's stronger than Kate. John will do that because John's quicker than Kate. John will do that because, Kate's just a first-year apprentice and Kate can't carry as many things as John, right? Those are really rigid gender norms. And just because, 50 years ago, all carpenters were male, it's 2023 now. So let's move past that and recognize that girls can do it too. Anyone can do it. And we don't need to see gender, and gender identity doesn't need to form a part of what we are seen as capable of or incapable of doing. Click. There we go. So what can you do? So if you're experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace, tell someone. The most important thing anyone can do is tell someone. My mum has always said, from when I was a little girl, and I tell my daughter the same thing, a problem shared is a problem halved. So you don't need to carry this alone. You must tell someone. Even if you tell your mum, you tell your friend, I'll give you guys my phone number. You can call 13 10 50 to talk to the Safe Work Contact Centre. I'm sure that Simone and Chris would happily take your calls, but you need to tell someone. You don't need to suffer this alone. So ideally, we want you to approach someone in your organization that you feel comfortable talking to. If your boss is John, poor old John's getting a run around here, but if your boss is John and John's the one harassing you, under no circumstances should you feel obligated to go to John and say, you're harassing me, I want you to fix it. Unless you feel comfortable in having that conversation, by all means have it. John, your behavior makes me really uncomfortable. I'd appreciate it if you stop. That's a great place to start, but not everyone's going to be comfortable in talking to John about John's behavior. So ideally, my recommendation would be, first step, if you feel comfortable, say to that person, look, John, I really don't like the way you're speaking to me, or John, I really don't like the way you're looking at me. Can you please stop? That's a great starting point. But again, and we've talked about the subjective nature of this, if you don't feel comfortable talking to John about his behavior, then the next best person to talk to is John's boss or HR. So if you have those avenues available to you, go for it. Hi, who's HR? HR can be Joanna. Joanna, I'm feeling really, really uncomfortable on site. This is what's happening. What they should do then is start an investigative process and support you through that. And it should be an impartial process that should identify those risk behaviors and then implement control measures to make sure that this doesn't happen again. That doesn't happen, that's when Safe Work come in. If you've spoken to John and asked him to stop and he hasn't, and you've raised it with your employer and asked them to stop and they haven't, or with the union or with VERTO or whoever, and the union's had that conversation with your employer, and despite all of those proactive steps you've taken, it's ongoing, then it becomes a Safe Work matter. So Safe Work we're very limited in what we can do with respect to sexual harassment in the workplace. And don't forget that if things go past a certain point, like stalking or assault, they become police matters. So please be aware that safe work in no way replace the police in their role in sexual assault and stalking or criminal harassment, so to speak. The police definitely play a role. But safe work can get involved. And what we do is we look at systems of work. So there's a clause in the Work Health and Safety Regulation 55, you're welcome to look it up, that talks about how employers must, as far as is reasonably practicable, identify any sources of potential psychological injury and implement control measures to prevent that from occurring. Any investigation process that's undertaken should be fair, should protect people from victimization. You should be communicated with every step of the way. Your confidentiality should be maintained as much as is reasonably possible. And you should be treated fairly. And when we say, you can see here on this slide, it says treat everyone fairly. When we're going through that investigation phase, we need to make sure we're treating the person who's alleged to have demonstrated these behaviours. So they need to be treated fairly throughout the investigation process as well. It needs to be a fair and just investigation process. And then we need to document that and make sure we implement corrective actions as a result. So, and look, what if they do nothing? And I got a little bit ahead of myself here, but, and I'm laughing at myself. So thanks for not laughing at me. You're all muted. You very well could be laughing at me. But if your employer does nothing, you can raise it with safe work. So we don't have the authority to make employment decisions in your workplace, like terminating someone's employment. But we can conduct an independent investigation to determine, are there factors in the workplace that increase the risk of harmful behaviours? Are there safe systems of work, including policies and procedures, to put in place or to set behavioural standards for workers and manage the risks associated with workplace sexual harassment? To ensure that the workplace has adequate supervision in place to prevent sexual harassment, and any investigation that we undertake will be transparent, confidential, and as timely as possible. So here's a nice summary. So workplace sexual harassment is prevalent, sustained, uneven, gendered, and witnessed. But it's not all of those things. So you can see that all of these boxes aren't touching one another because it doesn't always need to be witnessed in order for it to be sexual harassment. It doesn't always need to be prevalent or sustained for it to be workplace sexual harassment, because it goes through that subjectivity test that we talked about before. How would a reasonable person feel in the same circumstances? So let's also remember that it happens every day. It shouldn't, but it does. It affects some groups more than others. We talked about how the harassers are predominantly male, but that doesn't mean we can't be sexually harassed by a female. And it's very likely that other people in your workplace are witnessing this kind of behavior or know that it's taking place, but that doesn't mean that someone has to witness it in order for it to be considered sexual harassment. So pathways for reporting. So you've got Safe Work New South Wales, that's me. The Fair Work Commission have a, and I'm absolutely no expert, but they can issue stop sexual harassment orders by way of emergency hearing. You've got the Australian Human Rights Commission, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. And then again, if it is criminal harassment, stalking, sexual assault, don't wait to report that to Safe Work. Ultimately, if you are assaulted or criminally harassed in the workplace, we will get notified. But please, 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 if it is a criminal matter, contact the police because they can protect you. I can't. I'm just a safe work inspector. Some resources. So Safe Work New South Wales has the Code of Practice for Managing Psychosocial Hazards at Work. You're welcome to have a read. And if you've got any questions, again, you can give me a call. Safe Work Australia have a guidance document called Preventing Workplace Sexual Harassment. It's quite lengthy, but it's very, very good. And then there's some documents about what compliance and best practice looks like that we can provide to you to put on notice boards and things like that. If anyone is interested in those, I'm sure I can get some to you, no problem. And it talks about how all workers have the right to be safe at work and the potential outcomes of sexual harassment. So why we need to, take steps to protect one another against it.